What if I told you that more men fall because of misplaced mercy than from outright malice? That the greatest tragedies in a man's life rarely come from his enemies, but from his own inability to be firm when life demands steel. Every day, countless men crumble under the weight of their own softness. They swallow disrespect just to avoid discomfort. They excuse betrayal so they don't have to confront someone. They extend kindness to those who would never return it, and they glorify this weakness by calling it virtue. But what they call virtue is nothing but fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being labeled cruel. The early masters of power understood this truth long before our time. They knew that a man who hesitates to be firm loses both authority and dignity. The world does not reward gentle hearts, it exploits them. If you lead with softness, you attract predators. If you confuse patience with peace, you become a home for parasites. And if you chase approval instead of effectiveness, you exchange strength for sympathy. Ruthlessness is not destruction, it is preservation. It is the ability to cut cleanly, without hatred, without noise, when something threatens your purpose. The man who refuses to act will eventually be broken by the very things he tolerates. The ruthless don't rage, they decide. They don't shout, they enforce. They don't beg for understanding, they let their results speak. By the end of this message, you will understand why ruthlessness is not cruelty, but clarity. You will see when to be cold, how to master emotion, and how to create boundaries that are immovable. Because only the man willing to appear harsh in the moment earns respect that endures for a lifetime. And in a world that devours the gentle, such discipline is not evil, it is survival. Let us begin. Most men do not fall because of hatred. They fall because of kindness weaponized against them. From childhood, you're taught to be patient, forgiving, endlessly accommodating. Yet the ancient philosophers would laugh at such teaching. They understood something modern men forget. Kindness without limits is not virtue. It is exposure. It is the soft shell that invites attack. Think of your life. How many times have you smiled when you wanted to walk away? How often have you accepted disrespect simply because you didn't want a scene? How many times have you silenced yourself so someone else could feel comfortable? Every one of those moments was self-betrayal, a small sacrifice of your dignity, a quiet surrender disguised as peace. People rarely destroy you directly. They destroy you through guilt. They call you selfish when you stop giving. They call you arrogant when you stop explaining. They call you cruel when you finally enforce a boundary. But what they truly mean is, you stopped serving me. The weak hide manipulation beneath morality. They will never take your strength by force. They will make you hand it to them willingly. The ruthless man sees through this illusion. He knows that every unnecessary act of mercy creates a world that feeds on him. He understands that you cannot defend the good by rewarding the harmful. You cannot build order by tolerating chaos. So he cuts early, calmly, and without apology. Ancient thinkers taught that a leader must learn how not to be gentle if he wishes to endure. This does not mean becoming vicious. It means recognizing that mercy without measure invites collapse. The hesitant soldier dies. The forgiving ruler loses his throne. The endlessly tolerant man becomes invisible. Ruthlessness is the wisdom to remove what is decaying before it spreads. A surgeon removes infection to save the body. A general abandons a position to win the war. You do it not because you want to, but because it must be done. The world has convinced you that softness is noble, but true humanity requires strength. You cannot guard what you love if you cannot say no. You cannot lead if you fear confrontation. You cannot form deep bonds if you cannot uphold your boundaries. Look around you. The kindest people are often the most exhausted. They give endlessly and receive nothing. They confuse martyrdom with meaning. The ruthless are different. They treat their energy like treasure. Their kindness is intentional, measured, and rare. Ask yourself, how much of your life has been wasted trying to explain yourself to people who thrive on your confusion? The moment you stop apologizing for your standards is the moment your power begins. Because kindness without limits is simply self-harm, and the first step toward real strength is to stop executing yourself in the name of being good. Cruelty has long been misunderstood. The fragile see it as evil. The wise see it as a tool. Proper cruelty is not malice. It is disciplined protection. It is the ability to cause a small pain now to prevent a larger ruin later. This is necessary cruelty. It is harsh today, but it safeguards tomorrow. Nature understands this better than men. The lion kills without guilt. The storm uproots the weak without remorse. Life maintains balance through elimination. Only humans drowning in emotion call this cruel.
The ruthless man understands nature's law. Mercy without restraint breeds disorder. When you refuse to end what must end, you allow decay to spread until it corrupts everything worth defending. In business, leaders who avoid removing incompetence eventually lose their best people. In relationships, those who fear confrontation become doormats. In politics, those who try to please all end up governing none. Avoiding necessary cruelty is not kindness, it is negligence. History shows us that the most respected rulers were decisive. Their punishments were swift, not excessive. Their firmness restored balance. What looked brutal in the moment protected the future. Their cruelty was not wild, it was calculated. That is the difference between a brute and a strategist. The brute acts from emotion. The strategist acts from necessity. The strategist does not threaten, negotiate, or repeat himself. He enforces consequences so clearly that few ever test him again. Understand this: people respect what they fear losing. If you are always available, always forgiving, always patient, they will assume you are limitless. They will treat your standards as illusions. Necessary cruelty reinstates reality. It reminds them your tolerance is a choice, not a weakness. Cruelty without purpose is tyranny. Cruelty with purpose is strength. It is how civilizations endure, how empires remain stable, how individuals protect their minds. This ruthlessness is not about harm, it is about preservation. When enforced correctly, it sends a message: I am not here to be taken for granted. I am not endless. I am not afraid to walk away. But ruthlessness requires control. You cannot be firm if you are emotional. Anger clouds judgment. True cruelty is calm, surgical, and silent. The ruthless decide, act, and move on. To the emotional, it looks heartless. To the strategic, it looks inevitable. Because real cruelty is not an attack on others, it is protection of self. And the sooner you learn this discipline, the sooner you stop being prey and start becoming a force. Power begins not with dominance, but with mastery. Mastery of your mind, your time, your emotions, your presence. Every empire collapses first within its leader. The ruthless know this. They build control inside before they exercise it outside. They understand that power is perception. What people believe about you shapes how they move around you. Perception, distance, consequence. These are the three pillars of authority. Perception is more powerful than truth. People do not respond to facts, they respond to impression. If they sense hesitation, they will treat you as hesitant. If they sense firmness, they will move carefully. Thus, the ruthless craft perception deliberately. They do not react fast. They do not explain themselves. They keep their intentions hidden and their frame solid. Distance is the second pillar. The too accessible man becomes common. The more you give, the less you are valued. The ruthless creates space, physical, emotional, strategic. Their distance creates mystery. Mystery creates influence. People fear what they cannot understand. The final pillar is consequence. A boundary without consequence is a decoration. The ruthless enforce limits consistently and quietly. Once people realize that your silence is serious, your no is immovable, and your standards are real, they begin disciplining themselves around you. That is true control, not forced, but implied. The ruthless never beg for respect. They design an environment where disrespect feels dangerous. Power is built on certainty. Uncertainty breeds caution, and caution is the root of control. In the end, power is not about ruling over others. It is about ruling over yourself. The man who controls his impulses eventually controls outcomes. Ruthlessness is structure, order, discipline, not chaos. Weak men break because they cling to approval, cling to comfort, cling to relationships that drain them. Attachment breeds vulnerability. The ancients warned against depending on loyalty or affection, for once you do, you place your power in someone else's hands. Ruthlessness is detachment, not apathy, clarity. It is the ability to walk away from what no longer serves your purpose, to love without worshiping, to give without losing yourself, to feel without surrendering judgment. Most men crumble because they take everything personally. Their emotions respond to every opinion, every rejection, every silence. The ruthless man is not numb, he is disciplined. His emotions serve him, not the other way around. Detachment gives him vision. In battle, emotion kills. In business, emotion misleads. In life, emotion enslaves. Detachment frees him to make the decision others fear. To practice detachment, you must sever the need to be liked, the need to be right, the need to prove yourself. These needs are chains. When you end them, your judgment becomes clean, your direction unclouded. Your confidence comes not from praise, but from self-command. In this state, your silence becomes weight. Your presence becomes influence. People sense that you cannot be manipulated. They adjust their behavior accordingly. You become someone who cannot be owned. Detachment is not withdrawal. It is equilibrium. It is the stillness that remains when chaos tries to pull you apart. And the man who stays centered while others fall apart will always win, not because he is loud, but because he is inevitable. Ruthlessness is calculation, not rage, not impulse. The world is full of men who confuse chaos with strength. They lash out, react, overplay their hand. The truly ruthless are measured. They think like surgeons, not executioners. Every move has intention. Every risk has purpose. Every action has a return. Strategy is the art of seeing reality without the fog of emotion. Most men react. The ruthless predict. They sense pattern. They move before others even suspect a game exists.
Timing is everything. Strike too soon, you fail. Strike too late, you lose. The strategist waits. He studies. He watches. Then acts once, decisively. Calculation requires distance from emotion. You cannot strategize if you are drowning in anger or pride. You step above the moment and ask, what is the price if I act now? What is the gain if I wait? What remains if I lose? This distance turns disorder into opportunity. Even kindness becomes a tool. A single act of mercy, used purposefully, can win loyalty more effectively than fear. A gift at the right moment opens doors stronger than threats. All actions, kind or cold, must serve one purpose: control. Too much transparency invites attack. Too much secrecy invites rebellion. The ruthless reveal just enough to appear predictable, yet never enough to be read. Their silence hides storms. Their calm hides calculation. Their presence hides intent. They win not by force, but by design. Mercy in their hands becomes a weapon. Not softness, strategy. Forgiveness, when delivered sparingly, binds people with invisible chains. When you punish, they remember the moment. When you forgive, they remember the imbalance. The knowledge that you could have destroyed them, but didn't, creates a debt they can never repay. Mercy must be rare. If given freely, it loses value. But given strategically, it becomes influence. Mercy confuses enemies, disarms rivals, opens doors, gathers information. But mercy is not peace. It is the silence between storms. The ruthless forgive without trusting, pardon without forgetting, and show grace
without surrendering leverage. The difference between the fool's kindness and the ruler's mercy is intention. The fool forgives from fear. The ruler forgives from victory. Mercy used well stabilizes kingdoms. Mercy used poorly destroys kings. So mercy, too, must serve the throne. Finally, every powerful man must wear a mask. The mask of humanity. The world must believe you are compassionate, even when your heart moves with calculation. The great philosophers taught that a leader should know how not to be good, but should never appear otherwise. Because power is built on perception. People don't need the truth. They need an image they can trust. The naive reveal everything. They think honesty earns loyalty. But honesty without restraint earns exposure. The ruthless show only what strengthens their position. They smile when others expect warmth. They listen when others seek sympathy. They appear generous even when the decision is already made. This is not deception, it is diplomacy. The world itself is a stage of masks. The wise simply wear theirs better. The mask protects you. It softens your presence so your power does not provoke early resistance. But over time, the mask also shapes you. Pretending to be calm makes you calm. Acting confident builds real confidence. Appearing untouchable teaches you to become untouchable. The danger is forgetting to remove it in solitude. Power without reflection collapses into tyranny. Tyranny eventually consumes itself, so the balance must be held. Empathy outward, steel inward, because those who appear only ruthless are destroyed. Those who appear only kind are devoured. But the man who blends humanity with hardness, who hides a mind of iron behind a face of calm, that man rules until he chooses to stop.